This unit is about love, and in this video I'm going to talk specifically about the Benjamin Bagley article, Loving Someone in Particular. In this article, he defends an account of love that makes sense of the love that is professed between the characters Catherine Earnshaw and Heathcliff in the novel Wuthering Heights. Now, I think it should be clear that this is not all that love is, because of course love comes in many different varieties, and you can love different things and different people in different ways. Obviously, one loves one's children in a different way from the way one loves one's partner. But he's contrasting his view against the views of three other philosophers, Harry Frankfurt, David Vellopment, and Nico Kolodny. And their accounts of love that we're getting his version of, it's not clear that they're intended to tackle just this kind of love. So I think right at the outset, you could argue that defenders of these writers could say that their versions of love that he criticizes and says leave something out are not intended to cover the kind of love that he's talking about. And that's fair enough. What we're interested in here is whether or not his version of love, makes sense. Can we make sense of it? Because his account of improvisation is pretty tough to get a handle on. And second, whether or not it fits with what we think it's supposed to cover, which is sort of the kind of romantic love that certainly the movies that we're watching for this unit cover. I mean, there's romantic love. None of the movies I've asked you to watch are about, the love for one's children or one's pets or anything like that. They're all love affairs of one kind or another. So, if Bagley is right about his account of love, it should be applicable to most of the relationships in the movies that we're watching, like Brief Encounter, In the Mood for Love, Carol, Moonlight, My Summer of Love, all those. So, with that in mind, let's try and get a handle on exactly what Bagley's account of love is. Okay, so he begins the article, I think this is very helpful, with an extended quote from Wuthering Heights, where Ellen is questioning the young Catherine Earnshaw, who intends to marry Linton, Edgar Linton, despite really being in love with Heathcliff. Heathcliff only gets one name, by the way. That's his only name, because he was an adopted orphan, just found wandering the streets. I don't know why he only gets one name, but he does. And he's not the cartoon cat, so let's clear that up from the start. So, Ellen is questioning Catherine, it's her daughter who's Kathy, Catherine, about her reasons for loving Linton, the man she intends to marry. She asks, "Why do you love him, Miss Cathy?" This is on page 478. "Because he is handsome and pleasant to be with." "Bad," says Ellen. "And because he is young and cheerful." "Bad still." "And because he loves me." "Indifferent," coming there. In other words, that is not going to make the difference given what you've said before. "And he will be rich, and I shall like to be the greatest woman in the neighborhood, and I shall be proud of having such a husband." "Worst of all," says Ellen. "Okay, now say how you love him." "I love the ground under his feet and the air over his head and everything he touches and every word he says. I love his looks and all his actions and him entirely and altogether." Why? And we seem to be going full circle. What is the point of this cross-questioning? Well, the point is that Ellen, and in this Bagley sides with her, insists that only the right kind of reasons can explain real love. If Catherine's reason for loving Linton is that he's handsome and pleasant to be with, as she says, there are several other handsome, rich young men in the world, handsomer possibly and richer than he is. What should hinder you from loving them? So her point is that the reason for loving your true love should be unique to that person. That is, you shouldn't pick features of the person that you love that are repeatable, that are possessed by many people. Because then, if that truly is your reason for loving that person, then you have equally good reasons for loving that other person or that other person, and maybe better reasons because they're handsomer and richer. And that doesn't seem right. So now an assumption in this is that our true love should be for one person. Now, that's something that maybe will be questioned in our other reading for this week, which is about polyamory, the love of more than one person at a time. So it certainly seems to me an assumption that this kind of love is one-to-one. Now, so the challenge laid down by Ellen's Catechism is, if you're going to explain love, it seems like it should be in terms of things that are unique to your beloved. Now, what is her reason? So, of course, we know Catherine doesn't really love Linton. So this sort of seems to support Ellen's charge, because the reasons given by Catherine are these things that don't count, and clearly she doesn't actually love him. But she does actually love Heathcliff. Now, what is her reason for loving Heathcliff? Well, the reason she gives on page 479 is, whatever our souls, that is Heathcliff and Catherine's, whatever our souls are made of, his and mine are the same. Now, is that actually a better reason? It sounds like, everybody's souls are made of the same stuff. What is a soul? Of course, you can get into that. That's a different philosophical issue. But seems like, that's also a repeatable feature. Your soul being made of the same stuff seems like something that could be true of more than one person. And if you love, if Catherine loves Heathcliff for that reason, then it's a reason that could equally apply to somebody else. Because of this reason, that saying that you love someone for features of that person that they have implies that you should love everybody else who has this feature equally well. I'm going to use a prop at this moment. Imagine that you love Mrs. Potato Head, okay? You love her for her beautiful hair, for her lovely eyes, and for her beautiful kissable lips. Okay, that's why you love Mrs. Potato Head. Well, but look, those features are repeatable. You could find another person who has the same eyes. You could find another person who has the same hair. And you could find another person who has the same, lost a hair, who has the same lips. And never mind the nose for now. And now it seems like if your reasons for loving the original Mrs. Potato Head were the lips, eyes, and hair, well, here comes someone with the same lips, eyes, and hair. Should you love this one equally or perhaps more? So that's the first problem, which you could put this way. If features that your beloved has are sufficient to explain your love for your beloved, then that seems like wherever those features occur, you should love whoever has them, even if that's a different person. A related problem is, well, what happens when your beloved loses those features? What happens if Linton loses his money? What happens as he ages and gets less handsome? Should the love, if you loved Mrs. Potato Head because of her beautiful hair, eyes, and lips, are you going to still love her when she loses them? Will you still love me when I'm old and grey, as the song goes? It seems like if we want to give an account of the great romantic love that ideally persists through change and is unique to specific individuals, we can't explain that love through particular features of our beloved. Now, that charge is accepted by the three philosophers that the author Bagley challenges. So Harry Frankfurt, David Vellopment, and Nico Kolodny all agree that love cannot be explained by particular features. Bagley, on the other hand, is going to argue that yes, it can. If you get the right features, and they have to be a very special kind of feature that is able to persist through change. And so it has to be able to persist through change so that I still have the same reason for loving a Mrs. Potato Head now, despite the fact that she's lost 3 of her most attractive features. And also, so it can't be any one of those features. That can't be my reason for loving her. So what could be a feature of her that gives me a reason to love her that isn't any one of these? What could it be? So that's the first challenge that Bagley has to meet. And also it must be a feature of her that is unique. Because the problem with saying that it's the soul that you love, well, everybody has a soul. Everybody equally has a soul. Let's say that this represents the soul. This person over here's got one, this person over here's got one. Should you love everybody equally? Well, no, because love is, because we're assuming this kind of great romantic love is one-to-one. Catherine is unable to have the same love. If she has it for Heathcliff, she cannot have it for Linton as well. All right, so what Bagley is going to argue is there must be reasons for love. So in other words, love cannot just be inexplicable. That's going to be the position of Harry Frankfurt, as we shall see. So that's against Frankfurt, there must be reasons for love. Second, the reasons for love must be unique to that person. This is against the view of Vellopment. As we shall see, Vellopment argues that we should love people for something that everybody equally has, which is a certain bare, rational capability that is distinctive of persons. Other things don't have it. My pen doesn't have it, so I shouldn't love my pen, but it seems like every person has it, so then why don't I love everybody equally? And Bagley's going to say we don't. We just love our beloved. And finally, the feature that they must be something about the person themselves, and not just what you might call extrinsic reasons. So it must be reasons intrinsic to the person I love, built in, a feature of this person, independent of her context. Contrast that with Kolodny, and Kolodny says our reason for loving somebody must derive from the relationship that we've had with them. Now this seems to make sense of familial love. For example, why do you love your sibling? Why do I love my sister? It's not because we're that alike. We have certain features in common, but I have more in common with other people than I do with my sister, and yet I love my sister more than that. Why do I love my sister? Because she's my sister. Because of the relationship. Because we have had this. We've had this bond throughout our life. We've grown up together. We have a shared history. So that's going to be what Kolodny says explains love. And Bagley's going to reject that. That can't be the reason. It must be a reason that is intrinsic to the person. Now, he's prepared to accept that Kolodny's account makes sense of love, familial love, but he doesn't think it's going to make sense of, the kind of romantic love that exists between Cathy and Heathcliff. All right, so let's start with Frankfurt's account. Now, one of the things Bagley does is he takes from each of the three people he criticizes a feature about love that they stress, and he says that's right. So it's not as if he rejects everything they say. He says each of them gets something very right about love. And the feature that Frankfurt gets right is the irreplaceability of one's beloved. That is, that if I love Mrs. Potato Head, she cannot just be replaced by this other potato, this actual potato. You can't just replace your beloved with somebody who seems identical. There's actually a psychological condition that I don't know the name of, but it's a real psychological condition where you become convinced that your loved one has been replaced by a clone. And it is a mental disorder, and there's a reason for it. But you become convinced that the person living with you is not the real one, even though he or she behaves exactly like they've always done. In other words, even though you cannot point to any difference about them in terms of smell, memories, behavior, tendencies, tastes, whatever. They're identical in all tangible aspects, but you become convinced that it's not really them, and you cease to love them. Frankfurt's view makes total sense of that, because he argues his view of love is, one, there is no rational reason for it. This is Harry Frankfurt's view of love. There's no rational reason for it. So, in other words, he rejects Ellen's catechism right from the start. He would say to Ellen, don't ask me stupid questions. I can't say why I love this person. I love them. And a great writer from history who appears to share this view is Montaigne. And Montaigne, who's a famous essayist, famously said in an essay about his great love for his best friend, he was asked to explain it, and he said, because it was he, because it was I. In other words, I can't explain it. It's just us. We were meant to be. Now, notice what he's saying. He's not saying that there's anything particularly about us. It's just the us, the me-ness of me and the him-ness of him. This indefinable essence that is not composed of any features I can point to, like sense of humor or anything like that. If I start pointing to those reasons, I'm giving a rational reason. So Frankfurt says there's no rational reason. Love is involuntary. You can't choose to love someone. That kind of makes sense. And he says it is a mode of caring, a self-affirming concern for the existence and the good of what is loved, or who is loved. So, on Frankfurt's view, if I love Mrs. Potato Head, let's give her eyes back because it's a little creepy otherwise. If I love Mrs. Potato Head, it's not because of her eyes, it's not because of her beautiful pink handbag, it's not even because of her ears or anything like that. I just do. Did I choose this? No. It just happened. If I do love her, though, what this means is that I will have this attitude of having concern for the existence and good of Mrs. Potato Head. That's how my love will exhibit itself. That's what it is to love someone, is to have this concern. Now, Vellopment, who we'll come to soon, rejects Frankfurt's view, and he gives the example of, if that's what love was, then my loving my friends would mean that I have a general care for the existence and good of my friends. And what this would mean is that I would want to do things for them. But, says Vellopment, and I think this is a little selfish of him myself, but he says, I love my friends, but I don't want to do their laundry. By loving them does not bear fruit in this way. That's not what love is. So that's his first criticism. Second criticism is you can't just love anything. Frankfurt makes it sound like because it's involuntary and there's no rational reason for it, it could just happen. I know it's kind of sad that Woody Allen turned out to be a creep, but I will still continue to love some of his movies. And oops, her legs fell off. I still love her though. It wasn't about the legs. One of the early movies of Woody Allen's that's very patchy is it's supposed to be a film version of an enormously successful sex manual from the 70s, like everything I ever wanted to know about sex but was afraid to ask. So this was an incredibly best-selling book, and as kind of a joke, Woody Allen makes a film of the book. It isn't really, but it's full of these little vignettes of sexual problems. And one of them is the great Gene Wilder, whom you know from Willy Wonka and Young Frankenstein, I hope. Maybe I should make you watch those movies. He falls in love with a sheep. You know, he's just a regular guy, and somebody brings this sheep to him saying, I've fallen in love with a sheep, and he says, well, that's ridiculous, and then he sort of turns around and looks at the sheep, and this romantic music starts playing, and he falls deeply in love with this sheep. And, you know, it's played for laughs. But that seems possible on Frankfurt's view of love, that you could have this deep romantic love for anything. If there are no rational reasons for your love, then, and it's involuntary, then it could strike at any time. Now, it is actually true that there are people who claim to be sexually attracted to inanimate objects. And I believe there was a woman who wanted to marry the Eiffel Tower. I'm not making this up. But that doesn't seem like the love that we're interested in explaining. That seems like something has gone wrong somewhere. And to illustrate, the example that Bagley uses is it shouldn't be possible to fall in love with picnic table 7G. You could care for its well-being, but you can't love it in the way that he wants to make sense of. That wouldn't be love. And so by extension, if Frankfurt's account allows for the possibility of being in love, in romantic love with picnic table 7G, then so much the worse for Frankfurt's account. It must be incomplete, it must need fixing. But the thing that we take away from Frankfurt's account is that he's right to say that irreplaceability, any true account of love must explain the irreplaceability of it. Frankfurt's did so at the cost of giving no reason whatsoever. The problem that needs solving is that if you pick any particular reason, again like lips or whatever, then that doesn't seem to be unrepeatable. It seems like the same lips could be had by somebody else, and in which case you should love them equally. Where Frankfurt's solution was to say there's no reason at all. It just happens, and it is by its very nature just unique. So you just fall in love with this one person or thing, and there's no explanation for it. So given that there's no reason, that reason can't be repeated. So it was a way to get irreplaceability by getting rid of reasons. Bagley's going to say, no, we want irreplaceability, but we want it by having a reason that it is in itself unique to one person. Now, of course, the trick will be in coming up with a unique reason. All right, so on to the next person, the next philosopher that Bagley discusses, and that's Vellopment. Now, Vellopment is influenced by Immanuel Kant, and if you've had a class on Kant, it will probably be an ethics class. Kant is famous for saying that all persons, all moral persons, and by moral persons, philosophers in general mean beings that are capable of free choice. So, for example, not all humans are persons. If you're brain dead, for example, you could be alive technically in the sense of breathing and warm, but you would have no consciousness. You would not be a person on most modern philosophers' view. So you'd be human but not a person. You could also have a person who is not human. E.T., for example, is clearly someone capable of rational choice, clearly a being that could be ethical and that we should respect. That would be a person that was not human. So person is used in philosophy, moral person is used as a being capable of making choices that we should respect. And in fact, that's Kant's claim, is that we have a duty to respect all persons because of their capacity of free choice. And what this means is there are certain things you cannot do to persons because of this respect that is owed to them. You must respect their choices. You cannot lie to them. You cannot use them as if they were things. Kant says there's a hugely important moral distinction between a person and a thing. And a thing is something that is incapable of choice, and you can use it. There is nothing wrong with my using this pen. But if I use a person by manipulating them or controlling them, that is deeply immoral according to Kant. Vellopment is from this tradition. And Vellopment says we can sort of extend Kant's view and say that the minimal required attitude to persons is respect, but there's sort of a continuum, and on the maximum, the optional maximum attitude we can have to a person is love. So what love is it's optional. That makes him different from Frankfurt, who said it just happened. It wasn't something that you could control. According to Vellopment, it is optional, and it is sort of the logical extreme of respect. So respect requires that we be minimally decent to people. We not lie to them and whatnot. But love goes way further than that. If you love someone, there are the demands of love. You should treat them in different ways. Now, so love on Vellopment's view is a sort of conscious attitude towards another person. And now notice, Vellopment's view avoids the problem that Frankfurt's had, that you could fall in love with table 7G. No, love is only a relationship amongst persons, and tables are not persons. So it seems like Vellopment fixes at least one problem with Frankfurt's. But now the problem is, unfortunately, rational, what you might call a bare rational nature, which might be the soul that Catherine Earnshaw was talking about, that she and Heathcliff share. The trouble is, though, everybody shares it. If the potato represents the soul, then every person has one of these, has the capacity of free choice. I have it, you have it, everybody has it. Does that mean I should love everybody? Well, that's where the optional comes in. That no, it's not required that you love everybody. It's optional. Now, what the feature that Vellopment gets right, remember, for the three people he criticizes, Bagley says each of them gets some feature of love right. With Frankfurt, it was the irreplaceability. With Vellopment, it's openness. That is, you should be, on page 484, we have an account of what to be loved is by Vellopment. To be loved is to be valued as special, which entails being seen to have a value that you are singular in possessing. Well, that seems to suggest that you can't love everybody. This implies that the lover, the person who has the love, must be open to adapting his or her ends to his beloved. This is the feature, openness, that Vellopment gets right. You must be open to adapting yourself to your beloved. Now, Vellopment gives the example, of his love for his sons. And his love for his sons meant that he acquired an interest in lacrosse, okay, Morris dancing. No, I'm sorry. I guess I'm lucky that my kids were never interested in Morris dancing, but I think that's because I raised them right. Morris dancing is a weird abomination. I think it's from Britain, but that doesn't make it any better. In fact, it is a source of shame for my people. You can Google what Morris dancing is. You will be horrified. And photography. Fair enough. Photography is fine. So he took up an interest in each of these things that was genuine because of his love for his sons who were interested in these things. So that seems to be an illustration of openness, that you are prepared to adjust your values and preferences to fit your beloveds. But while this makes sense of, again, his love for his children, it doesn't. First of all, love does not seem to be optional. This is Bagley speaking, because otherwise, if it was rational, in other words, if you could, your love could be based on reasons that make sense to you, and you choose to love someone, then clearly Catherine should choose to love Linton. I mean, because Linton is just so much better for her. I mean, apart from anything else, Linton is actually a perfectly nice person, whereas Heathcliff is a gloomy old bastard. I mean, if you read the book, I read the book long time ago when I was required to, and I just couldn't stand these people because it's very as the Germans say, Sturm und Drang. It's very kind of a lot of drama. And Heathcliff is just kind of brooding and, you know, the kind that goes for long walks in the driving rain, and it's like pretty tedious from my point of view. It would make much more sense to love Linton, who's a perfectly nice guy and also rich and handsome. I mean, it's stupid to love Heathcliff. So if she had a choice, then clearly she would and should have loved Linton. But that's not romantic love. She didn't have a choice. She loved Heathcliff. She just did. And it wasn't something that she could change. So that seems to be a problem with Velleman's view. And also, if your reason for loving someone is that they're a person, then it seems like we're back to no reason whatever for choosing to go to the option, the optional maximum attitude of love, rather than sticking at the required minimum attitude of respect. Why do I love some people but just respect the others? What makes the difference? Seems like there should be a reason. Obviously, the reason if in your children is obvious. But what's the reason with strangers that you fall in love with? Doesn't seem like Vellopment can help us with that. All right, so on to the third philosopher that Bagley tackles, Kolodny, Nico Kolodny. Now, the thing that he gets right, the feature that he stresses correctly about love, is constancy. In other words, why is it that I continue to love Mrs. Potato Head as she ages and bits start to drop off? She loses her formerly attractive features. Why isn't it that my love continues? Why do I continue to love her? That's a puzzle that is raised by the original catechism. If I loved her for her nose and her ears, why is it that I continue to love her when she loses those? The constancy of love has to be explained, and the three writers that Bagley discusses think it can't be explained if you give particular features of your beloved to explain your love. All right. So recap. Against Frankfurt, Bagley says love must be for a reason. It can't be for no reason. Against Vellopment, the reason can't apply to just anyone. It has to be a specific reason, specific to my beloved. But again, it can't be just any reason. It can't be just her ears or her wealth or something like that, because then that doesn't explain the uniqueness. So Kolodny comes up with a feature of someone that does appear to be unique to that person, and that is the relationship you have with them. Now notice, as I said before, this is an extrinsic relationship. Imagine that by some freak of nature, there was somebody who was identical to one of my kids. If the reason I love my kids was because of features about them, then I would have exactly the same reason for loving this clone. But I don't. Why not? Kolodny says the answer is obvious. It's because your kids are your kids, and this person is no relation to you. So he takes this idea and runs with it, and he says your reason for loving someone is the relationship. So on page 486, this is summarized. Your reasons for love are grounded in the value of your ongoing relationship with your beloved. So loving Mrs. Potato Head consists of believing one's relationship with Mrs. Potato Head to be of the right type. I don't know what that would be. So the better example is loving my kid. Loving my son, or one of them. Loving one of my sons consists of believing my relationship to them to be of the right type. Father-son relationship is obviously a loving relationship. Two, taking the relationship to be a reason to be emotionally vulnerable to, and B, acting in the interests of both the beloved, my child, and the relationship, the father-son relationship. So I'm supposed to be emotionally vulnerable to my child and the relationship, and I'm supposed to act in the interests of my child and the relationship. And the third feature is I must believe that others in similar relationships would have similar reasons. So I love my son. What that means is I believe that all parents should love their children because of the parent-child relationship. Okay, now the advantage of this view is it explains why it is a reason for loving someone. I love someone because, not for no reason, which was the problem with Frankfurt. I love someone because of my relationship. And it's a reason that makes total sense to us. And it is a unique reason. It is not a relationship that you can have with just anyone. Or insofar as it is repeated, I have two sons, I feel like I have equal reasons for loving each of them. I don't love one more than the other because, one is smarter or better looking than the other. I love them both, independent of their other attributes, because they are both my children. Now, of course, this makes it unsuitable, really, to explain the kind of relationship that Bagley's getting at. That sort of one-to-one romantic relationship. Unless, of course, you believe Elizabeth Brake, who argues that that's exactly what could be true. You could have romantic love with more than one person, and she explicitly gives the parallel of different kinds of love, including familial love. But Bagley seems to be sticking to this assumption that you can only have this kind of relationship with a particular beloved. All right, criticisms of Kolodny's view of love. First of all, it's too broad. It seems like the feature, Kolodny suggests that if there is any relationship that has these features, then it will be a loving relationship. And Bagley says teaching has this kind of, is this kind of relationship, but it is not a loving relationship, despite the fact of you caring for the well-being of the relationship and the person who you're teaching. You don't love them. It gives the example on page 488 of Harry Potter. What's the name? The head of the one who's played by Maggie Smith in the movies. Her relationship with Neville on the one hand and Hermione on the other. Neville turns out to be pretty important in the end, as I recall, but still, Hermione is clearly a favorite. Whereas, if teaching, so the suggestion with the example is that, what's her name? I can't remember the name of that character. 488. She uses her first name, which you never tend to use. Minerva, that's right. She's got that Scottish name, hasn't she? Minerva has the same teaching relationship with both Neville and Hermione, yet clearly she loves Hermione more. So the teaching relationship is not the same as a loving relationship. Also, you can have a kind of relationship that you value to someone without loving them in the form of a marriage. And he gives the example from Anna Karenina. Anna's husband, Alexei Karenin, values the marriage without really loving Anna, which is the tragedy at the heart of the book. Now, another implication of Kolodny's view is that the person you love, you give us sort of sliding doors. I used that term because there was a movie that I've never actually seen, and I won't require you to see, because it stars Gwyneth Paltrow, called Sliding Doors, where it imagines sort of, it maps two parallel worlds, one where she goes one way through a sliding door and the other where she goes another way or doesn't go through the sliding door or something, and different lives spin out on the basis of this one choice. Suppose you marry Smith, and you live with Smith and lives with Smith, and Jones was a friend but you never married them. According to Kolodny's view, you should be able to say, having been married to Smith for decades, you could say, I love Smith, but had I married Jones, I would love Jones just as much as I now love Smith, and Smith would be as unimportant to me as Jones is now. And Bagley thinks that's wrong. That shouldn't be true of true love. Okay, you be the judge there. So, we've now gone through all three of the alternative views, and it's time for Bagley to spell out his view. On page 490, he says, like Catherine and Heathcliff, the greatest lovers and truest friends love each other for what they in particular are like. In other words, features that they actually have. And these are not just relationships, because a relationship is not a feature that you really have. A feature that you really have is a feature of you. There's a term called Cambridge change, which means if relational features were the same as intrinsic features, then you could change without you knowing. For example, suppose my daughter had another kid. My daughter. I don't have a daughter. My sister. What's going on there? My sister had another kid, which would be very unlikely given her advanced age, but anything's possible. Suppose she had another kid. Without knowing, I would be a new uncle. I would have a new relationship. I would be an uncle to that child. Would I have changed? No, not in intrinsic features. I would have changed my uncleness would have changed, but that is not a built-in feature of me. That's a relational feature. What Bagley is suggesting is that you have to love someone because of a feature that they genuinely have. Now, going back to what Catherine says about Heathcliff. She loves Heathcliff for his soul. Bagley takes that to mean character or identity. And character and identity suggest to him values. So he says the features that are going to be important are not going to be physical features like eyes and nose or monetary features or something like that. Those don't count. Ellen's right to dismiss those at the beginning. The kind of features that are the right features are things that reveal your values. What you value. That is the important kind of feature that your love should have, that you can base your love on. He goes on page 490, someone who loves you selectively for the specific values you identify with sees you for who you distinctively are. So they're loving you for who you are, and that's so important to his view of love. And finds you distinctively valuable as such. I value because of what you are. I love you just the way you are. That is a key to true love, according to Bagley. However, then we're back to the puzzle that this whole thing started with. Is this conception of love has to be for a reason, a distinctive reason about one's beloved, is that compatible with irreplaceability? What if somebody else has that feature? Openness. Is it going to be the case that you can change and that your beloved can change? And constancy. Will your love for this person persist through the changes they go through? Other people can have those values other than your beloved, whatever values you love in your beloved, and the values can change. Tastes can change. Bagley's response: a beloved's values are loved as things that are essentially in the process of being determined through a kind of ongoing improvisation. So here's his response. Values, there are values that can persist through change. So a value, the kind of important values are not static values. So it's not like my love for super sweet candy. I had that as a kid, I don't have it anymore. That's a value about me that's changed. Would someone who loved me as a kid be able to love me if the reason they loved me as a kid was because of that value? Would they still love me here? Well, that's the wrong kind of value. The right kind of value that should be the reason for loving someone, according to Bagley, is this kind of value that can change. Now, this is where it gets tricky. He says, this is where the discussion of Keith Richards comes in, and the song that I must confess I'd never heard, which is, I know Exile on Main Street is regarded as one of the great, if not the greatest, Rolling Stones album, but it's a 70s album, and I only care about the 60s Rolling Stones. But apparently on that album there is a song called Happy, that Keith Richards said began with just kind of a riff, and then he improvised with the band, and they made something out of it. And this discussion of musical improvisation, clearly Bagley is a fan of jam bands. If he likes Fish, I'm afraid I'm just going to junk his whole theory. But and why he picked the Rolling Stones instead of jazz, why not pick Charlie Parker? I guess maybe Charlie Parker died before he could write down his theory of improvisation, whereas miraculously Keith Richards lived to write an autobiography. He uses improvising as an analogy for producing the kind of values that one should have as reasons for loving someone else. Now, he says he says we should contrast acting for a reason in two different circumstances. The normal way of acting for a reason, and his example of this is walking down Mulberry Street to get to the post office. Why am I walking down Mulberry Street? Because I believe the post office is at the end of it and I want to get to the post office. All right, contrast that with, why did you play that riff? Why that one? I mean, we know why you're walking down Mulberry Street rather than Main Street or whatever that you're exiled on. Because of the two, Mulberry Street leads to the post office. So that we can explain your setting out down Mulberry Street because you had a goal and you knew this was the way to achieve that goal. That seems to be different from improvising. Why did you play that riff rather than another riff? At the time, the real answer is, I don't really know. So does that mean you're not acting for a reason? Does that mean you're acting irrationally? And we're back to a view like Frankfurts, where love is irrational. No, says Bagley, because when you play a riff to express your musical idea, you presuppose your action to be justified in just exactly the same way that your walking down Mulberry Street was justified. Even though the explanation is as yet unsettled. You can't say, because the post office is at the end of it. You don't know what's at the end of it. And the explanation is unsettled because you don't know in what way expressing your musical idea is going to be realized. It's an abstract idea, and you don't know the concrete nature of what it's going to turn into, the song that's going to result. So, quote on page 494, to improvise is to pursue an end whose content depends epistemically, that means as far as you know, and ontologically, that is, it will come into existence. Ontology is the nature of being. It will come to be, it will come to exist on the actions that you actually take over the course of pursuing it. So, and he gives a couple of quotes to illustrate this kind of thing. Page 495, a quote from the painter Edward Hopper. His famous picture is the Nighthawks at the Diner. There's often hideous reproductions of this where they replace the people in there with people like Marilyn Monroe and Humphrey Bogart. Horrible. But he's famous for pictures where the landscapes tend to look desolate and the people just look kind of sad and alienated within them. Anyway, Hopper says, if you could say it in words, there would be no reason to paint. Which suggests that you can't express what it is that you're doing. You have to paint, and the painting that results will be your expression. So why do you start painting that? You don't know when you start it, but there is a reason. You're not painting for no reason. The reason is the picture that results. So if you start painting, you say, why are you doing that? And what you should say is, you'll see. And then at the end you can say, this is why I was doing it. But you couldn't have described that before you started painting, particularly in an improvisation. In an improvisation, you're not playing music from a score, you're just trying stuff out and seeing what rebounds back from your bandmates. I assume, I don't play. Gerald Postema also gives a quote, melody thinking is holistic thinking. So that is, a melody isn't any particular individual note. It's the whole thing. You can't know what the melody is when you start playing a note. It's what results at the end. All right, on page 496, he introduces the term, this is Bagley again, deep improvisation. He says, in deep improvisation, you determine the content of basic values you identify with, values that define the way of life you find fundamentally worth leading. And the great thing about this is that it can be done with others. In fact, improvising with others is the best kind of improvisation, when you bounce ideas off each other. And that's what Keith Richards is describing in producing the song Happy. You know, he strums a riff, and then the other members of the band sort of respond to it, and that gives him new ideas. So it's only working as a whole that you can produce it. One person acting on themselves would not have produced that song. It's only when you produce it working together. So the whole is greater than the sum of the parts. Now, so you get the idea that he's going to suggest that a love affair is like a joint improvisation, and what you're responding to in each person is the values, but those values are going to be unique because they're going to be constituted by what results at the end of this improvisation. So it's almost like Aristotle's view of happiness. Remember, Aristotle's view of happiness is you can't know if you had it until the end of your life and you look back on your whole life. Was it a happy life? You can't say from any moment, oh, this moment is happy, this moment is happy. You have to look back at the whole life and say, was it lived well as a whole? Bagley's giving the same suggestion about values. What values was I responding to in my loved one? It's the values that we developed by living together. But how do you know when you fall in love with someone? How do you know that's the person that I'm going to share values with? Because they don't have them yet. So that's a puzzle for his view. Well, he draws an analogy with the band, with Keith Richards' talk of improvising with the band. How do you know that your bandmates or that your lover shares an end? How do you know that you both have the same goals? Well, on page 497, he says something like this. You recognize your bandmates, or presumably your lover, as having provisional authority to contribute. In other words, you take them as someone whose input you're going to value, and then you see what happens. You reciprocate in making beautiful music. If so, the music that you produced was the end that you were aiming for, and it's what he calls, on page 499, a self-fulfilling prophecy. But as he freely admits, taking someone to share your end, in other words, taking presumably someone as prepared to be the one who engages in deep improvisation with you and, a love affair, may be rationally undetermined. You may not be able to say, I love that person because of this, this, and this. You just say, this seems to be the kind of person I could make music with. Doesn't that make it a leap of faith? And he said, maybe, but that doesn't make it irrational. He said, so that I'm not agreeing with Frankfurt. I'm not saying you should love someone for no reason. He says there's a different, the reasons of love and art are different from the reasons of morality and science. Morality and science are like walking down Mulberry Street. You have to know what you're doing in advance. Reasons of art, like painting a picture. Why am I painting this here? I'll know when it's finished. Why am I falling in love with this person? I'll know when we've made sense of it. So it's not arbitrary. So his view doesn't fall victim to the problem that Frankfurt's did. Frankfurt's view said that you could fall in love with table 7G, whereas that's not possible with Bagley's view because you can't improvise with a table. So table 7G reoccurs again on page 500. All right, on page 501, to love people for who they are in particular is to value them as partners of deep improvisation. And in the rest of the pages, he summarizes how his view of love can also have the advantages that he picked out from each of the three views of Frankfurt, Vellopment, and Kolodny. So he says interpersonal love differs from other forms of improvisational partnerships. He says you can have improvisational partnerships in doing a project at work or something. Interpersonal love is different from this. It differs from other forms of improvisational partnership because the ends the lovers share constitute fundamental values with which they identify. That's what he's been saying. For example, Catherine and Heathcliff love each other for their wildness and are engaged in working out just what this wildness means to them. So ideally, what this is mutual self-creation. That is, you and your partner are making each other. Obviously, an unequal partnership is where you just allow your partner to control you. That's wrong. That's not improvisation. You're just following. You're not a partner to the improvisation. True love is when you're open to each other, you're bouncing ideas off each other, you're not trying to control one or the other, and you are making yourself. You love someone because of what they bring out in you, what they allow you to make yourself. So they're making you a way, but you're also making yourself something because of your relationship to that other person. So you can love yourself more because of that person. So the three features that his view has to exhibit are constancy, and he says it does. Remember, this was the advantage of Kolodny's view. Yes, his view of improvisation does allow for constancy because you stick with your partner through the process. Remember, you're not going to stop loving someone. You don't stop in the middle of the improvisation. The improvisation is ongoing. Of course, change is part of the point. So constancy was staying with someone through the changes. Well, improvisation, it's a constant process. So the changes aren't going to stop you loving someone. That's part of the point of loving someone. All right, the feature that Vellopment had that was right was openness. And obviously, you can't improvise without openness. If you're doing it wrong, you're just following the other person's lead. and you are not open to them. Whereas good improvisation is each person being open to the other, saying, oh, I see what you did there. I'm going to take that and run with it. Here it is back. Okay, and then you run with it and sort of you make it bigger and better. A good example would be if you listen to a description by Paul McCartney of how he and John Lennon used to write songs. One song I think of in particular, so I've just laughed at Bagley for picking a song by the Rolling Stones, and I'm doing the Beatles, but there's a song on Sgt. Pepper, with a little help from my friends. No, it's getting better, that's what it is. And there's a line that it goes, I've got to admit it's getting better. And then another one comes in and says it couldn't get no worse. So that's sort of the sweetness of Paul is alleviated by the sourness of John, and they sort of bounce these musical ideas off each other, and they create something that works together. And as is well known, once they split up and went their separate ways, they were never as good individually. Okay, so that's openness. Third one is irreplaceability. This was what Frankfurt got right. He said, the irreplaceability, the uniqueness of your lover was explained by it not being a rational reason, so it couldn't be shared by anyone else. Bagley rejects that, says, no, it's got to be the right kind of reason, but it is unique. And the uniqueness is improvisation is different with any partner. So I can only improvise in a particular way with a particular partner. So it is kind of like a relationship. You can point to the unique improvisation you've done with someone in the past, but it's not just the past, it's that you are aware of how you work together, and you work together uniquely. So you work out your own values by working with the improvisation and partner. The things our lovers bring out in ourselves might be things we can do by us, might not be things that we can do by ourselves. And he says on page 506, this is why great pairs are often opposites. And he gives an example of Kirk and Spock, because each one brings something different. And I wouldn't have thought of something like that by myself, because that feature is not in me. But when I see it in my partner, then I can produce something I wouldn't have otherwise. And he quotes Catherine on page 506 that love creates an existence of yours beyond you. So you are different by being in love with someone else, but they are, in a sense, validating you by responding to you. So this is why love is good for you, because it makes you see yourself as outside in the world. A little bit of you is realized in your partner. And this provides affirmation of your distinctiveness. All right, so that's Bagley's View. And, I've spent an hour on one article. It's a very long article, and I will get to break in a different video. What do you think? Now, as I said, it does seem to be that he is giving an account of just one type of love. It's not the love that you will have from your pets or even for very young children. I mean, perhaps we feel, those of us who've had young children know that there is a powerful love that you feel for your young children that is unique. You often don't give a shit about anybody else's kids, but you feel this powerful love for your children, despite the fact that clearly they are too young to be improvising with you. Now, of course, they have these features that set you off. They make eye contact with you, when your child smiles when they see you, and they are evolutionarily designed to do that fairly quickly. But you can love even difficult children when they are not improvising with you. Does that mean that this love is different? Does this mean that... and what about romantic love What about when your partner starts to get Alzheimer's? Does that mean they are no longer an improvisational partner, and your love is now qualitatively different? It's no longer the love that you had before. It's a different kind of love. These are the kind of questions that I want you to ask for yourself in assessing Bagley's account of love. But there it is. It's a very interesting account, and I think he's right that the analogy is a very interesting analogy. That improvisation is a real thing, and it does seem to be an analogy for certainly what some kinds of relationships do. There we go.